Okay, let's go ahead and get started. We're going to do it that Dr. Porter is going to be advancing our slides, and then I get to post them on our system, which is hopefully works this time. So thank you very much for coming, everybody. This is our Careers in Transportation. We're trying to do a series, and we're lucky to have Dr. Porter from the University of Utah speak to us. These are all some of our graduate students. We did try to invite undergrads, but we're thinking this might be a class conflict time that we haven't anticipated. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Hopefully, definitely can they interrupt with questions? Or yeah, so definitely interrupt with questions. We have at least one person online, so if they have questions, we can hear or get them to participate also. So thank you.
All right. Well, thanks very much for inviting me to this careers seminar. Hopefully I'll present something that's somewhat interesting and useful to you as you're progressing through your transportation careers. The way I thought I'd go about this is maybe just provide some opening remarks, but as I'm doing that, as I said, please interrupt with any questions, and then hopefully the second part will be much more for questions and some additional discussion. And so I'll sort of start with my experiences as I've progressed through my career to this point and talk about some of my close collaborators. Not really because there's some magical moment that I could say, yeah, this is where I chose transportation engineering, but hopefully it'll give you an idea of just, you know, for me personally, I would still consider myself fairly early career, just a broad range of things that I've gotten to work on and a broad range of things that I work on with collaborators. And to me, that's the number one attraction of transportation engineering, just a huge range of issues and topics that are always evolving, and with that, it requires us to be always evolving our skill set in order to work on those issues. And so I'll start with this. This is where I get to go to work every day. It's quite beautiful, and so I'll start with sort of how did I get this lucky? How did I get to this point to get to work at a place like this at the University of Utah? We're a member of the Pac-12. Our engineering has been growing quite rapidly over the last 5 to 10 years. I guess it's a little bit of an unorthodox story. I grew up in southwestern Pennsylvania, and I'm actually going to head back there after my seminars today to visit family. But in this part of Pennsylvania, certainly coal country and coal mining territory, many of these coal patches popped up around the time frame that you see here. So when steel production was taken off in Pittsburgh and you needed coke from the coal to produce steel, there were sort of these two famous people around the area, Andrew Carnegie. You've probably seen the Carnegie name on many things, and Henry Clay Frick. And Frick was in charge of the coal mines, and he built these little coal patch towns that the coal mining companies would own. They would never really sell them to their workers. The workers would come work in the coal mines. They would live in the homes. They had to buy their groceries at the company store. You may have ever heard a song, I Owe My Soul to the Company Store. That's where that comes from. Groceries there were probably 3-4 times as high as you could buy them elsewhere. There was a heavy Eastern European immigration to these little patch towns, and coal miners at that time were heavily Eastern European, including one half of my family. And so it was a very interesting history. The coal patch, there's an example of the coal patch, actually the one that I grew up in, Vesta number 6. Pretty interesting, unique name for a town. That was Vesta number 6 coal mine that was attached to that town. This is the Monongahela River that flows into Pittsburgh. You see Vesta 6 was part of Dembo, thriving population of 713 people. slide. Cold pounds on very paranoid now. Anywhere we move, I want to know where all the floodplains are because it wasn't a lot of fun being that close to the river whenever flooding came. There's my dad. He was a coal miner for 30 plus years. So we finally convinced him to retire a few years ago. And the reason I tell you this is it had a little bit of a bearing on sort of my career path. My parents' number one goal was for me to be the first person on either side of the family that wasn't a coal miner. And so I was going to go to school no matter what. They didn't care for what, but I was going to try to break that chain of coal mining. Not that it wasn't a profession that we were all proud of, but it was a tough profession. So to try to find something a little more stable. And so I did end up going to Penn State. I chose civil engineering again. From being the coal miner, being around Steel Town, I wanted to work with steel. I connected that with civil engineering. It was really nothing more thoughtful than that at the time. And I went for the first couple of years. I thought, yeah, this is great. This looks good, but I want to be a coal miner. And I told that to my dad, and he said, okay. And at that time, he did the smartest thing he could have done. He got me a job in a coal mine in Cumberland, West Virginia. I worked there for one summer. That was enough to say, okay, I'm going to go back to school. Finished my civil engineering degree, and not only that, it scared me so much that I just kept on going and never went too far from the university environment again. And so I, in the early parts of my Penn State career, I was heavily focused on structural engineering. It just seemed to me like that was the part of civil engineering that was most calculation-oriented. I loved the 30, 40, 50-page engineering paper, homework assignments, and really continued on that path until I took my first couple of transportation classes as a senior. And at that time, every student was required to take one class from each of the sub-disciplines of civil. And I still strongly believe in that approach because that's what sort of influenced me to say, wow, this is really interesting stuff. Can I stay for my master's degree and take some more transportation courses? And that's what I did. I had an opportunity right around the end of my master's degree to do some unique work I'll talk about at Virginia Tech, and then went back to Penn State for my PhD and spent a couple years at Texas A&M as a postdoc before joining the University of Utah. Before I get into a little bit more detail on transportation engineering, maybe one more unique fork in the road in terms of my career. I played a lot of sports through high school, and I needed something to sort of keep that sort of competition going. And through graduate school, I started to play a lot of golf. And over time, started to play a lot of competitive golf, and that just sort of helped me, sort of keep sort of the competition aspects that I liked going from a sports perspective. I started to win a few local amateur tournaments around that time, and actually had a pretty unique experience. Does anybody know who this is? This is Michelle Wee, Stanford alum, very successful women's professional golfer. Well, right towards the end of her amateur career, her number one goal was to be the first female golfer to play in the Masters. And so there was really only a couple ways she was going to get there, was to win some of the major men's amateur tournaments that automatically resulted in an invitation to the Masters. And so one of those was the U.S. Amateur Public Links. And so she came to a qualifying site in Pennsylvania. And a lesser-known part of her history is she ran into a civil engineer from Penn State on one of his home courses during the U.S. Amateur Links qualifier. So there was about 100-some people in the qualifier. It was a 36-hole qualifier. After the first 18 holes, she was in the lead and I was one shot back. So as a hometown person, that attracted a lot of attention, and there was quite a few articles like the one you see here. I won't tell you the conclusion or who won, but I'll just say that there's Michelle with her U.S. Open trophy, and I'm here giving a transportation careers seminar talk. Let me go back to my master's degree and around that time at Penn State and just kind of give you an idea of some pretty unique areas that I worked on that are connected to transportation engineering that still has had an influence on my career today. My very first research project was actually a project looking at signs on storefronts. And particularly there were cities passing different types of ordinances of how large a sign could be, whether it had to be parallel sort of up against the business or if it could be perpendicular like this where people might be able to see it better. And so we actually did a real-world study where we went around State College. It reminds me a lot of what I've seen here so far. And we asked local businesses, can we come up with a fake name for your business for a while, develop a sign, hang the sign out front for a few months, all these different configurations and sizes. And we actually developed an experimental design where we had subjects drive around town and look at the visibility of those different types of signs. And so that was sort of my introduction into what I'll call the human factors world. I sort of continued that and worked on a project. There was a local consulting firm that recruited graduate students from Penn State. So they were more a research firm. It was run by a psychologist. And he was looking for somebody at the time to help him with a few research projects. And so then I sort of continued on this human factors front and did a study on headlight glare for AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety. And again, sort of learned a lot about nighttime visibility, how visibility works, how glare affects visibility and the comfort of drivers. And this actually still today remains my highest cited study if you look at various publications. That sort of connected me with Virginia Tech right at the end of the headlamp glare study. The last resource, we started to conduct one of the very first roadway lighting studies on the smart road. And so the smart road was just developing. The facilities were much smaller than they are now. There was a lighting system installed which allowed us to look at a wide variation in lighting designs. And specifically what we were looking at the time is something called small target visibility. The basic idea here is that you would think that you might want to design a lighting system to look as much like daytime as possible. But in fact, at nighttime, if an object was in the road that had a reflectance that resulted in smaller contrast with the surroundings, people wouldn't be able to see that. And they wouldn't be able to see it anywhere in the lighting system because it was all uniform. And so if you could actually maybe design a lighting system to look a little bit ugly, lots of lighter spots, darker spots, you actually maximize the chances for somebody to be able to see that object at a variety of different locations on the road instead of having one sort of uniform set of luminance or lighting. So again, a pretty interesting experience. So that sort of transitioned me. I was still working for the last resource while I was working on this lighting study at Virginia Tech, but as I was down there, they brought me on board to help with a few other studies as well. Some of the early versions of the rear, the backing cameras that you see pretty common in vehicles now. I did some more work on enhanced nighttime visibility systems for vehicles. And that's continued to help me because I've continued to sort of apply this human factors knowledge to my job today. And part of that is we've built a driving simulator at the University of Utah. And from the Virginia Tech to human factors folks, I really learned a lot about experimental design and statistical analysis from research involving human subjects and all those types of issues involved. And sure enough, I'm just applying it most recently with some of the Sharp 2 naturalistic driving study data that Virginia Tech has collected and needed to have all the training in place to deal with human subjects data. And so that continues to be useful. We conduct quite a bit of human factors research on our simulator. It's a very unique simulator. As far as I know, the only one like this exists at Turner Fairbanks Highway Research Center because we have a connection to VISM microscopic simulation. Are you all familiar with that? And so we worked with our contractor to build our simulator. We worked with PTV, who creates VISM, and created this real-time connection between our simulator and VISM. And so whenever we have a driver come in, the driver is actually one of the vehicles in the VISM simulation model. So that driver is reacting to vehicles. Those vehicles are reacting to the driver. And so we can not only look at the performance of that driver, but we can look at the much broader surrounding network performance. It allows us to replicate signal timing and some complex urban scenarios much better in our simulator than you could in a traditional simulator. So a little bit more background in terms of the University of Utah. I had something, again, pretty unique happen. I joined in 2009. At that time, I was the junior person in the transportation group. We had an associate professor that did planning. We had a senior professor that did more operations. And then I was brought on more in the design and safety areas. 2 years into my, 2 years after I joined, both of them actually got recruited to other locations. And so they left, and all of a sudden, sort of 2 years into an assistant professor career, I was the senior person in transportation. And so I was certainly left with a great facility, our Utah Traffic Lab. I was left with some great partnerships. We're part of a University Transportation Center as well, the Region 8 Center, the Mountain Plains Consortium. And so it was actually my job to build a new team. And the dean and the chair remained supportive of transportation. And I got put in charge of more search committees than I could have ever imagined at that stage of my career. So many of you that are thinking about faculty careers, you'll find that as an assistant professor, we stay focused on what we're really good at first and try to build a program around that area. But this really required me to take a step back and broadly look at the transportation engineering profession and think about how do we want to rebuild this program and attract people. And so that's what I started doing. And this is where we've ended up. Our first hire was Dr. Milan Zlatkovic. The Utah Traffic Lab at the time had a reputation in traffic signal systems. And after I joined Utah, everywhere I went and said, well, I'm a faculty member at the University of Utah, they would say, well, I know about the adaptive signal work. And so I wanted to keep that going. And so Milan was our first hire there, and he works in the areas of signal systems and public transportation, traffic flow theory. Our next hire was Kathy Liu. She has a PhD from the University of Washington and works in the areas of traffic operations, large-scale simulation modeling, accessibility analysis, big data. And then we just recently hired Dan Fagnet, who I believe was a graduate student colleague of one of your new faculty members from the University of Texas. And he does work on automated self-driving vehicles, is what he's most known for. But he also has significant experience working for a state DOT. So these start to give you an idea of some areas that I'm going to talk about that we felt at the time are just the emerging areas that needs to have some sort of coverage in a transportation engineering program. We also have a couple of other full-time researchers and staff to run a new data initiative that I'll talk about just a little bit later. Some of my collaborators, and I did want to mention these because, again, this kind of gives you an idea of the broad range of issues that transportation engineers, just myself gets to work on. David Strayer and David Sanbon-Matsu are psychologists, and we have collaborations in the distracted driving area. And particularly, we're looking at some of the SHARP2 data and looking at whether we can uncover how people self-regulate. Do they put their cell phones aside when they get in more complex traffic scenarios, for example? Larry Cook is an associate professor of pediatrics. He actually takes crash data that we're housing now at the Utah Traffic Lab and merges it to hospital data to try to get a more accurate representation of the levels of injuries that people truly sustain in traffic crashes. And because of privacy involved, you can't just say, well, this was the person in the crash, tell us who was in the hospital, we want to match these together. He has to develop a probabilistic linkage, and he has to say, well, this person in the crash, there's a 99.8% chance that it was this person that arrived at the hospital 20 minutes later that appears to have the same name, but it's written a little bit differently, and so he works on a variety of algorithms to make that match. And then some recent collaborations, Matt Dietz and Kurt Hagman from Family and Preventative Medicine was one I never would have imagined when I joined Utah, but we're doing some work on, they're interested in occupational health, and specifically we're looking at truck drivers' health characteristics and whether that influences their propensity to be in a crash. And so lots of, again, just a wide range of areas. And these are some of my collaborators, and the only reason I show this, we've had some great partnerships, and I wanted to show who they are, but also I've been pretty connected to academia, but I've had a chance to see transportation careers from a variety of perspectives. And so from the local government perspective, for example, when we work with Salt Lake County, the city government when we work with Salt Lake City, the state government when we work with the Utah Department of Transportation, Utah Department of Public Safety, maybe a sort of a variation of public and private agency when it comes to the Utah Transit Authority. Federal agencies, whether they be people in resource offices and in the field, or in Washington, D.C. in the Office of Safety, the researchers as well. And we have some great university partners, many consulting partners as well, and I get to observe a lot of differences there between larger consulting firms, medium-sized, maybe one or two person consulting firms that do purely consulting, others that do a mixture of consulting and research. And so I think I've gotten to see a very broad range of transportation engineering careers, some of the differences, but also there's a lot of similarities when we actually sit down and talk about some of our objectives and developing an employee on their end versus mentoring your graduate student on my end. There's a lot of similarities involved. And so that's a little bit of sort of a background of my experiences and some of my collaborators, again, just to kind of give you a broad range just for one person of interests and experiences that I've had. Now I was going to try to present a few key and emerging issues and challenges in transportation engineering. This is by no means intended to be comprehensive. There's many organizations such as TRB and others that will compile groups of people that are much smarter than me to develop visioning documents. What are the major issues in transportation over the next 20, 30 years? These are just some of my insights, mainly from things that myself and the group at the University of Utah that I introduced you to are working on. And so let me first start with, at least in my mind, trying to develop a framework for transportation engineering. Every year I get asked to come into our freshman seminar and try to define transportation engineering, and I still can't really define it. And so I've developed, instead of a definition, I call it a working framework because it's something that's always in development and changing. But the way I look at it, transportation engineers plan, design, and operate transportation infrastructure. We do that to provide direct transportation support. And by transportation support, what does that mean? I'll propose that it means providing these things. Accessibility to people to be able to conduct activities or reach destinations. Efficiency in their movement. Quality of service. Reliability and safety. I think you could think about any mode of transportation, and this is really a pretty good sense that for that mode, this is what it means to provide direct transportation support. However, there's some broader objectives to this. We're not just providing transportation to provide transportation, it's supporting something else. And these broader societal goals are things like community life, economic prosperity, and so forth. And then finally, we have some other goals for these, our transportation infrastructure as well, that for this support to be provided in cost-effective, context-sensitive, and environmentally sustainable ways. And so I think oftentimes we think about transportation engineers as being really good at this part, linking the decisions that we make to transportation outcomes. But it's certainly becoming more and more important for us to understand how does this tie into the broader society or community goals. Is it cost effective? For example, you're seeing more and more work at trying to incorporate different societal costs and societal benefits into benefit cost analysis, as opposed to the traditional benefit cost analysis that we learned about in our engineering economics courses. And so this is, again, I call this a working framework, but I think many of the issues that I talk about, you can tie back into this framework in some way. So let me start to present you with a few issues, and hopefully that will open up the floor for other discussions. Let me start with this one. Where do you think this is? Where's, any guess on location? It's actually that beautiful place that I showed on the second slide. So I love Salt Lake City. This is the one disadvantage that for a few months of the year, January, February, in there, this is what it can look like. Because of the fact that it's in a valley surrounded by mountains, depending on the weather patterns, the air just gets stuck until a storm comes in and clears it out, and then all of a sudden we got the greatest air quality again in the country. You see a picture like what I showed. And so this is, as you can imagine, extremely important issue for the people of Salt Lake City, and one that's closely tied to transportation, as emissions is a major contributor to what we see here. And so we have a variety of different strategies that we work on to try to manage demand, particularly private auto use, during these times of these inversions. And so sort of the first emerging, it's an issue that's been around, and certainly you're familiar of it with the theme of your center, sustainable urban transportation and communities. It's certainly a very pressing issue in transportation engineering. A big part of this theme for us in Salt Lake City is transit. We actually have one of the fastest growing transit systems that you'll find anywhere. It's fantastic. Light rail, longer distance commuter rail, great bus system. And so we do a lot of work with our Utah Transit Authority. And let me just give you an idea of some of the issues that are important to them right now that we're helping them with. The first is this issue called the first mile, last mile problem. Is anybody familiar with that? The idea here is that it's not really the transit ride itself that is an issue that keeps people from riding transit or choosing transit over the automobile. It's really that first leg of the trip to get from your home to transit, and it's the last leg of the trip to get from transit to wherever you're going. So that's how to make that part of the trip more attractive is what's called the first last mile problem. So that's some of the things that we're looking at right now. We're looking at all the fixed transit stations, the light rail, bus rapid transit, and in just studying the area surrounding, looking at different possible sheds of attraction, half a mile, and how can we make that transit station more accessible. And so there's some accessibility analysis that goes with this. What's the population living around this transit station? What are the businesses that are located around this station? That's given us an idea of the opportunities that are there for people to use this transit station. But then also, what are some of the impedances? What's keeping people from using those people from using this transit station? And what are some strategies that we can take a look at? And so this involves anything from looking at shared bike strategies at these locations. Autonomous vehicles could eventually be a big part of the first last mile solution. But it also involves some other pretty unique analysis, like, well, if we're going to conduct some improvements, again, let's not do the traditional benefit cost analysis. Can we actually incorporate health benefits from people changing from a private auto mode to a non-motorized mode and accessing these stations? What is that going to do to their health over time, and can we actually look to incorporate that into a benefit cost analysis? And so those are just some examples of the types of issues that we're looking at with this first last mile analysis, and some things that the Utah Transit Authority are interested in. We do a lot of work for UTA on transit signal priority, again, a topic that is of much interest to them. Really different ways to design intersections and design signal timing technologies that result in sort of a win-win for everybody, and looking at sort of people movement through an intersection versus vehicle movement. So we're doing some work not only with sort of a more traditional transit signal priority, but also with an adaptive priority algorithms. Given all the data that we now have, counts on buses, the transit vehicle can make the call and then also say, well, I have this many people on board, I'm this far behind schedule, give me the green, and then the algorithm makes the decision from there on whether to provide priority to that system. And so sort of a more fixed or traditional PSP, but also this kind of adaptive PSP. So those are some issues, again, that the theme of urban sustainable transportation and communities is much broader than that. These are examples of a few things that we're familiar with and that are important to the transit authority that we're working on. The second issue is an issue that's been around for a very long time, but it will remain an important issue, and that's traffic safety. Certainly, we probably won't hear anything about traffic safety in the presidential debates or anything like that. But if you ask any agency, any public agency at the federal level, at the state level, at the city level, at the local level, they'll all tell you safety is our #1 priority. And it will remain to be the case when you see numbers such as this. The #1 cause of death from the time that you're 4 to 35, very significant in rankings next to cancer and heart disease that you find as a cause of death in the U.S. is traffic crashes. And so this will remain a critical issue that we continue to have much work left to do. We have much that we can learn from other countries, as you see here in the United States. It's pretty far down in the ranking compared to what you would think. So, you know, what's different in these other countries? What can we learn? What can we apply? What challenges do we have to implement some strategies that have been successful in other places? I think this will continue to be an emerging issue. And then not even shown here, traffic safety in developing countries. Totally different crash characteristics and crash numbers. What can we take from what we've learned here and apply at those locations? One thing that I do want to mention here, many states, quite a few states have started to adopt what they call a zero fatalities initiative. We want 0 fatalities on our road network. And I think what you're starting to see that's really exciting, there used to be a group at a state that would deal only with the behavioral stuff, seat belts, motorcycle helmets, speeding, and then they would deal with the enforcement stuff as well. Then there was the DOT that dealt with all the engineering countermeasures. What can we do to the roads, the traffic control devices, and so forth. You're starting to see much more blurred lines and really in states that are really effective with their speed management programs, those groups really working together, and engineers are starting to have to become much more familiar and interested in what's going on at the behavioral side as well. If you look at the fatalities in Utah, a significant percentage are still people that are not buckling their seatbelts. And so what can we do to finally get through? That's much more of a behavioral, a sociology issue. And so that's where we're going to make some of our biggest gains. Engineers now have to start to learn, develop that skill set to continue to work towards these 0 fatalities. The third issue I'm showing here is just a very simplified version of the project development process from planning, identifying issues, projecting into the future, identifying issues and potential projects, programming, funding those projects, design, construction, and operations, sort of a very traditional flow of project development. I think most major projects fit into these steps pretty nicely. But really what you see is much more of a transition to what I'll call performance-based project development. Using different tools to quantitatively estimate the benefit of a decision that you make during the project development process, important decisions. And with MAP 21, for example, you see requirements related to performance-based planning and performance-based programming. If you're going to fund this project, how does it benefit local, state, regional objectives, and try to quantify that benefit, develop a set of performance measures that you're going to use to say, yep, this project fits into our broader overall strategy. From the design perspective, we've seen things switch much more from what I'll call a criteria-based approach. I go into my green book, I have an urban collector, I got the design speed, and here's my minimum lane width and so forth. Much more to a performance-based approach where, again, project by project, looking at the context of that project. What are we trying to do here? What are those broader intended project outcomes? Again, the economic development, social interaction. What are we trying to do with this project? And then establish our design around those intended project outcomes and use a set of performance measures to see if we're meeting those intended project outcomes. So a much more, I'd say, informed, this is what I call context-sensitive design. You have a specific context, developing a project design around that context as opposed to just using a set of design criteria that's blanketed for a certain functional classification. Here's one of the challenges, though, with performance-based design. Early on in a project, we have the most flexibility to make major changes. As the project progresses, we have less and less flexibility to make any changes, but we have more and more data about that project to conduct performance-based analysis. And so it's sort of a conflict that we always deal with. And so looking at ways, we're actually, maybe we should conduct a little bit more design at the planning stage, invest a little bit more at that time so we could develop our ideas further and make more informed decisions about exactly what we should do. And then finally, the last one that falls under here, I'll call it data-driven maintenance management. Utah Department of Transportation, for example, has gone out and on every inch of state road, shot laser in every direction and has the most detailed data set of assets that I've seen anywhere. And so they're using this from an asset management perspective. We're using it from a safety perspective. Extremely detailed data sets with everything that you could possibly want about any feature that's above the road surface. And the maintenance group at the Utah DOT are very interested in how they can use this, other types of data, statistical analysis to make the best investments year to year in their maintenance programs. So again, all these types of things are what we see in sort of performance, what I'll call performance-based project development. The fourth area, go back to this project development figure, and certainly one of the most rapidly emerging issues is how are these connected and autonomous vehicle technologies going to impact the business that we conduct? How is this going to change how we plan for facilities? How is this going to change how we design facilities, operations? All these types of things are going to be heavily impacted by the emerging vehicle technologies. One example here that my colleague Dr. Fagnet is working on is, what would happen if we take something like the technology in an autonomous vehicle, the idea of a shared vehicle, and combine those together, and we had a fleet of shared autonomous vehicles. So they may be one or two vehicles like you see there with the Google driverless car, or these may be shuttles. And so you have significant sharing going on where you have these autonomous shuttles carrying people and dropping them off at different locations. And that's some of the things that he's working on. He took the network of Austin, Texas, and he said, what if I had a fleet of these conducting a certain percentage of the trips? What's that going to look like? And he simulated where these things were going to pick people up, where it was going to drop them off, how many times it was going to have one person on board, how many times it would have more than one person. What did that do to the overall transportation demand on the network? And these are some of the things that he found. He simulated over 56,000 of these shared autonomous vehicle trips. Each shared autonomous vehicle was able to serve the same number of trips as 10 personally owned cars each day. There were more vehicle miles. Instead of being parked for a significant portion of the day, you now have these things going all over the network, dropping off and picking people up. So you actually do have an increase in vehicle miles, and that's something that needs to be thought about. Obviously, that increase isn't going to be as high if you have a shared fleet, and it's not just a private autonomous vehicle. And he found that the wait times are actually quite minimal from the time you call the vehicle from the time it picks you up. And so he has some very other interesting findings and sort of possible policy impacts of these types of vehicle technologies. But again, sort of all those stages of project development are going to be impacted by these vehicle technologies. That's certainly a hugely emerging issue. And then the fifth and final issue that I'll bring up is data integration, data-driven decisions, big data, informatics. This is certainly a huge emerging issue in transportation engineering. This is something that we're working on for both the Utah Department of Transportation and the Utah Department of Public Safety. We're developing a crash database at the University of Utah. And so the crash reports come in from police officers that are reporting about the crash. They're all kept electronically on in a repository. We're taking it from there and developing a database structure and a database that will be most useful that both of those agencies can access, conduct more analysis, and make more data-driven decisions. The near-term goal is the crash data, but also after that we're going to be looking at citation data, overlaying that on the crash data, crime data, overlaying that on the crash and citation data, really developing this huge layered database that's related to public safety. And how can we mine that data, again, to make more informed decisions on how to improve public safety. Another big issue is the use of social media data. This is some things that my colleague Dr. Liu is working on. We just have massive amounts of data from Twitter, from Facebook, and so forth. What can we learn about it that assists us in the transportation engineering? And so, for example, can we use patterns about where people conduct activities, how long they're there, how they got there, really to develop these activity-based transportation planning models? Can we see if somebody posted any sort of message before they were in a crash and get some sense of what their mental state was and what their mind was on prior to a crash? All these types of opportunities are there, and so another sort of hugely emerging issue in transportation. And so with that, those were my 5 issues. I know for me, my opinion of transportation engineering has changed quite a bit. I always, for a long time, thought about it as sort of these manuals. We have these manuals that we use. We have a basic 4-step planning process. We conduct design using the Green Book. We conduct operational analysis using the Highway Capacity Manual. We look at the manual on uniform traffic control devices to install traffic control devices. And this was transportation engineering to me as I was probably an undergraduate into a master's, and things have just changed so dramatically if you look at these 5 issues and you start to think about what needs to be our skill set to be successful transportation engineers. And I really don't have an answer for that because it's always changing. I've only been a faculty member for 7 years, and I'm already having to learn new skills to work on the things that I just showed you today than what I had when I joined the faculty at Utah. When I went to Texas A&M, I didn't have any safety experience. But I saw this move towards quantitative safety coming down the road. And I knew this was a skill set I needed to be successful. And so those several years there, I really spent developing that new skill set that I took to Utah. Now I'm at Utah, and I built a program in safety, but I see all these other changes that are happening. And again, having to go back and adapt that skill set to the emerging challenges. And that, to me, is what's so exciting about transportation engineering. I think more than many other fields, there's that constant adaptation and a huge range of issues that we're working on that have such an impact on society. And so with that, that's sort of the close of my presentation. I'd be happy to open it up for any questions or comments.
I mean, this is all very, very interesting. I guess we could clap now and you guys thank you. So I guess one thing that I was talking about, so Brian Park's research group is definitely trying to have a simulator that has CSIM connected to it. You guys know, not quite as cool as we do. So and part of that is work that Adele Stavic is doing, and so they have communications program and the simulator, and yeah, so they try to match a whole bunch of stuff to do way cool, like environmental measures or something, like how the vehicle, the drivetrain works and all that sort of stuff. So so that work is going on here at Virginia. But yeah, it doesn't look as cool.
We were one of the very first ones to establish that VISM connection, and so we hired a contractor, AAI, and they run the simulator at Federal Highways Turner Fairbank Highway Research Center. So they were really the simulator experts. We had Dr. Zlatkovich that I showed you, he is a VISM machine. I've never seen anyone know VISM inside and out as well as him. And so those two worked together along with PTV to establish these connections. And on sort of a lot of that